I just recently had to renew my retirement visa. It's only once a year, but it does take some time. So I use a visa service. At this time in my life, time is worth more than money, and it's worth much more than the money I spend on the visa service. But that got me to thinking of what immigration was like back in the day, back in 1969. This is a story of karma and the infamous fat man of Chiang Mai. Back in the 1960s, there were only a few hundred foreigners and expats living in Chiang Mai. They were the consular people, the DEA agents, the CIA agents. None of them had to worry about immigration. Then there were the missionaries and a couple of dozen volunteers. Now, the nickname we gave to the fat man was not being derogatory about the weight challenged, although he did have considerable girth. He was named after a character in my favorite movie, Casablanca. Now, Casablanca won the Best Picture Award for 1944, starring Humphrey Bogart and Ingrid Bergman. I mean, who wouldn't fall in love with Ilsa?
Play as time goes by.
Oh, I can't remember it myself. I'm a little rusty on it.
I'll hum it for you. Da-da-da-da-da-da. Da-da-da-da-da-da.
The immigration officer was named after the Sidney Greenstreet character, who was always doing nefarious deeds. Back to our story. Back then, the immigration office was a wooden house out on the Merim Road, a little outside of town. It was a small one-officer department. When it was time to do our visas, we'd gather our forms together, our photos, all the things we knew we needed, and we'd present them to the fat man. Now, he'd sit behind his desk, chain smoking and chain drinking tea that his subordinates would bring him. He'd look over our forms and say, there's something missing, you got something wrong here, come back tomorrow. Now, this happened every time to everyone who went to immigration. So we had to budget at least 2 days to get our visas settled and get away from immigration for another year. But then, one day, karma set in. And for the whole expat community of Chiang Mai, it was time to celebrate. Well, I got to talking to the young lady who was waiting for her visa like me. I looked over her forms and it looked like she had everything she needed. She said she just needed to extend another 30 days because she was visiting one of her classmates from back in America. Her classmate was Thai and she lived here in Chiang Mai. So she was making a nice visit here. The fat man called her up. She went up, handed him the papers and all the other things, her passport and all the things she needed. He grunted at her, and in Thai, because he didn't speak much English, only a few words, in Thai he started berating her for not having the right forms and pointing his fingers at the forms. And she said, I don't know what you're talking about, help me please. And he just said, tomorrow, come back tomorrow. And just kind of shoved the papers back at her. Well, for the rest of us sitting on the bench, we were used to this, so we knew exactly what was happening. But the poor young lady was pretty upset. She was almost in tears. And As she walked out, I called to her and I said, hey, listen, I'll see you tomorrow. Because I knew the same thing was going to happen to me, which it did. The next morning, as I entered the immigration office, I saw the young lady sitting at the wait bench, and she had a big smile on her face. I was kind of confused, but I walked in and I looked over at the desk, and the fat man wasn't there. There was a replacement. And the people who would walk up to hand him the papers, he would look at them, stamp their visa, and let them go, which was kind of confusing because that had never happened to any of us. So I got to talking to her, and I said, well, what happened? And she said, well, I went home, and we were having dinner with my friend and her father, and he asked me how things went in immigration. And I said, well, I had everything thrown back at me and I have to come back tomorrow. And he asked, what? Your forms look good to me. And she said, well, the immigration officer told me to come back. So I asked her, really, where are you staying? Who are you staying with? And she says, well, it's a big yellow house right on the river. And I said, a big yellow house right on the river? That's the governor's mansion, isn't it? And she said, oh yeah, he's the governor of Chiang Mai. So you're staying with the governor of Chiang Mai, I asked? She said, yeah, my classmate is his daughter. And she asked me to come for a visit, and it's been wonderful. She was then called up to the desk by the new immigration officer. He looked at her papers, stamped her passport, and she was off. It was my turn. I walked up and I handed him my papers, and he did the same for me, stamped my passport. And I said, hey, what happened to the other officer who was here? And he said, well, for some reason, he was sent to the border at Mae Hong Son, the Burmese border. And I knew exactly what happened. And that's why the whole expat community in Chiang Mai was celebrating that day. Here's looking at you, kid.